The blood had dried on the kitchen floor. 8 separate wounds marking where she'd fought for her life in a Baghdad safe house 3 months ago. Now, as Sarah Mitchell sat peacefully in her Phoenix home sipping morning coffee, she had no idea that by sunrise, her quiet suburban street would be transformed into a military operation zone. The neighbors thought they knew the woman who lived at 1247 Mesa Drive, a soft-spoken government contractor who kept to herself and tended her small garden. They had no clue that the scars hidden beneath her long sleeves told a story that would make international headlines, or that her morning routine was about to be interrupted by the most elite fighting force in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell appeared to be the most unremarkable resident of Sunset Ridge neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona. At 34, she maintained the kind of invisible presence that allowed her to blend seamlessly into the fabric of suburban American life. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who worked remotely for some unspecified government agency, the kind of person who waved politely from her driveway but never lingered for extended conversations. She drove a modest Honda Civic, kept her lawn meticulously maintained, and could often be seen reading on her front porch during the cooler evening hours when the Arizona desert began to release its grip on the day's heat. The 2-story house at 1247 Mesa Drive sat unremarkably among its neighbors, with beige stucco walls and a red tile roof that matched dozens of others in the planned community. Solar panels gleamed from the rooftop, a common sight in Phoenix where the relentless sun provided both challenge and opportunity. A small vegetable garden occupied one corner of the backyard, where Sarah grew tomatoes and herbs with the precision of someone who understood the value of self-sufficiency. The interior was furnished simply but comfortably, with neutral colors and minimal personal decorations that could have belonged to anyone. What made Sarah different wasn't visible to casual observation. Her morning routine began at precisely 5:30 each day, not with the gradual awakening of most suburbanites, but with the immediate alertness of someone trained to assess threats before her feet touched the floor. She checked her security system, scanned the street through carefully positioned mirrors, and performed a systematic review of her perimeter before starting the coffee that would signal the beginning of her public day. These habits were so ingrained that she performed them unconsciously, muscle memory from years of training that had become as natural as breathing. Mrs. Helen Abbott lived directly across the street and had appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator. At 78, she maintained detailed mental notes about every resident's patterns, visitors, and unusual activities. Helen had noticed that Sarah's schedule never varied, that she received no personal visitors, and that her mail consisted primarily of official-looking envelopes rather than the catalogs and personal correspondence that filled most mailboxes. What Helen found most intriguing was Sarah's physical condition. Despite her quiet demeanor, the woman moved with the fluid efficiency of an athlete, and Helen had glimpsed enough during summer months to notice that Sarah's arms bore fading scars. That suggested a more eventful past than her current lifestyle indicated. The neighborhood itself represented the American dream made manifest in the Sonoran Desert. Established families mixed with young professionals, retirees from colder climates, and military personnel from nearby Luke Air Force Base. Children played in carefully planned parks while their parents maintained the kind of community bonds that made suburban life appealing. Block parties happened regularly, holiday decorations appeared seasonally, and the Homeowners Association maintained standards that preserved property values and community pride. It was exactly the kind of place where someone seeking anonymity could disappear into the comfortable rhythm of ordinary American life. Sarah's work-from-home arrangement provided perfect cover for her actual situation. She maintained regular video conferences with colleagues who believed she analyzed intelligence reports for a civilian contractor supporting overseas operations, Her home office contained the expected computer equipment, reference materials, and secure communication devices that made her story credible. What wasn't visible were the additional security measures woven throughout the house, the emergency protocols she maintained, or the specialized equipment stored in locations that appeared to contain nothing more than seasonal decorations and household supplies. Dr. Emily Chun worked the overnight shift at Desert View Medical Center, where she had treated Sarah Mitchell 3 months earlier. The case had stayed with her not because of the severity of the injuries, though 8 stab wounds certainly qualified as a major trauma, but because of the patient's remarkable composure and the unusual circumstances surrounding her treatment. Sarah had been flown in from Baghdad on a military medical transport, accompanied by personnel who spoke in whispers and carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. The official paperwork indicated a civilian contractor injured in a workplace accident, but Emily's experience with combat injuries told a different story. What had struck Emily most forcefully was Sarah's behavior during treatment. Despite multiple deep lacerations requiring extensive surgery, Sarah had remained conscious and alert throughout her initial assessment, asking specific questions about her prognosis and recovery timeline with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating tactical information rather than personal medical crisis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd refused pain medication beyond what was absolutely necessary for the procedures, maintaining that she needed to stay clear-headed for important decisions. Most telling was her apparent familiarity with combat medicine, correctly identifying the types of sutures being used and making informed observations about her own treatment that suggested professional medical training. The medical records from that night had been classified within hours of Sarah's discharge, which Emily had never encountered in 15 years of emergency medicine. Military patients occasionally received treatment at civilian facilities, but their records remained accessible to the treating physicians. Sarah's case had vanished into administrative black holes that Emily's clearance level couldn't penetrate. When she'd inquired about follow-up care, she'd been informed that the patient's ongoing treatment would be handled through specialized channels that didn't require civilian medical support. Marcus Thompson had been working as a janitor at Desert View Medical Center for 7 years, but his colleagues didn't know about his previous career as a Navy corpsman who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. His current job provided the quiet, routine work that helped him readjust to civilian life after experiencing combat medicine in some of the world's most dangerous locations. The night Sarah Mitchell arrived, Marcus had been cleaning the trauma bay when he overheard enough conversation to recognize that this wasn't a typical civilian emergency. The coordinated efficiency of the military medical team, the specialized equipment they brought, and the patient's own professional responses to medical procedures told him this was someone with extensive combat experience. Marcus had made a point of checking on Sarah during her recovery, using his maintenance access to observe without interfering. What he'd seen confirmed his suspicions that this woman was far more than a civilian contractor. Her awareness of her surroundings never diminished, even under sedation. She tracked personnel movements, evaluated security protocols, and maintained the kind of situational awareness that came only from years of operating in hostile environments. When she'd noticed his presence, she'd given him a brief nod that somehow conveyed both recognition of his military background and appreciation for his discretion. No words had been exchanged, but Marcus understood that he'd encountered someone whose service to the country continued in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Officer Lisa Rodriguez had been first on scene when the call came in about suspicious activity at 1247 Mesa Drive. The report itself had been unusual, multiple neighbors calling about unmarked vehicles surrounding the house, men in tactical gear taking positions, and what appeared to be a coordinated law enforcement operation that no one in the Phoenix Police Department had been notified about. Lisa had expected to find federal agents conducting a raid or arrest, but what she discovered defied every category in her experience. The men surrounding Sarah Mitchell's house wore no identifying marks, carried equipment she didn't recognize, and responded to her presence with professional courtesy that somehow made it clear she was in over her head. The operation had lasted less than 6 hours, beginning before dawn and concluding with the midday Arizona sun beating down on a street that looked exactly as it had the evening before. No arrests had been made, no evidence had been removed, and no official reports had been filed. The tactical teams had simply departed as silently as they'd arrived, leaving behind only the confused recollections of neighbors who'd witnessed something that didn't fit any normal pattern of law enforcement activity. Sarah Mitchell had emerged from her house once during the entire operation, speaking briefly with what appeared to be the team leader, before returning inside with the calm demeanor of someone attending a routine appointment rather than the subject of a military-style operation. Detective Ryan Parker had 22 years of experience with the Phoenix Police Department, including 8 years working major crimes that had given him exposure to federal operations, organized crime investigations, and the occasional overlap between civilian law enforcement and military activities. When Officer Rodriguez filed her report about the Mesa Drive incident, Parker recognized immediately that this fell into categories beyond typical police work. His attempts to gather information through normal channels had met with polite but firm redirections from federal agencies who acknowledged that an operation had taken place but declined to provide details, citing national security classifications. What troubled Parker wasn't the existence of classified operations. He understood that certain activities required secrecy, but the complete absence of coordination with local authorities. Even the most sensitive federal investigations typically included some level of communication with local law enforcement to prevent conflicts and ensure public safety. The Mesa Drive operation had proceeded without any notification to Phoenix police, suggesting either a breakdown in normal protocols or activities so highly classified that standard interagency cooperation had been suspended. Parker's experience told him that Sarah Mitchell was either in serious trouble or possessed, significance far beyond what her suburban lifestyle suggested. Sheriff Robert Hayes had served in various capacities in Maricopa County law enforcement for 31 years, long enough to develop informal relationships with federal agencies and military personnel stationed throughout Arizona. His phone calls regarding the Mesa Drive incident had yielded unusual responses from contacts who typically provided at least general information about federal operations in their jurisdiction. Instead of the expected briefings or assurances about public safety, Hayes had encountered the kind of careful non-responses that indicated highly classified activities involving personnel whose work couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. The morning after the operation, Hayes had driven through Sunset Ridge neighborhood himself, observing a community that showed no visible signs of the previous day's unusual activity. Neighbors went about their normal routines, children waited for school buses, and the entire area maintained the peaceful suburban atmosphere that made it attractive to families and retirees. Only the most observant residents seemed to retain clear memories of what they'd witnessed, and even those accounts varied significantly in detail and interpretation. Sarah Mitchell's house appeared completely normal, with no indication that it had been the focus of what several witnesses described as the most extensive tactical operation they'd ever seen in their neighborhood. Captain James Wilson supervised security operations at Desert View Medical Center, where his responsibilities included coordinating with law enforcement and federal agencies when patients required special protection or presented unusual security concerns. The night Sarah Mitchell had been treated, Wilson had received instructions to implement the highest level of security protocols, typically reserved for foreign dignitaries or federal witnesses under threat. The personnel who'd accompanied her had carried credentials he'd rarely encountered, and their security requirements had included measures that went far beyond standard patient protection. What had impressed Wilson most was the seamless coordination between the military medical team and the security personnel. These weren't separate agencies learning to work together, but components of a unified operation that functioned with the precision of long-established protocols. The patient herself had participated in her own security arrangements, making informed suggestions about perimeter coverage and access control that demonstrated professional expertise in security operations. Wilson's 30-year career in military and civilian security had exposed him to various types of protection details, but Sarah Mitchell's case represented something entirely different. Not someone being protected from external threats, but someone whose own capabilities required careful management to maintain operational security. The morning of the operation, Sarah had awakened at her usual time with no indication that this day would differ from the hundreds of quiet mornings that had preceded it. Her security check revealed nothing unusual in the immediate vicinity, and her communications equipment showed no messages requiring immediate attention. She'd prepared her coffee, reviewed her schedule for the day's virtual meetings, and settled into the routine that had provided stability and cover for the past 3 months. The first indication that something had changed came not from her security systems, but from the subtle alteration in ambient sounds that her trained senses detected automatically. Professional operators develop an unconscious awareness of their environment that functions even during routine activities. Sarah's morning coffee ritual included positioning herself where she could observe multiple approach routes while appearing to read news on her tablet. The normal sounds of suburban Phoenix at dawn included early commuters, delivery vehicles, and the gradual increase in activity as the community began its daily cycle. What she detected this particular morning was the absence of certain expected sounds and the presence of others that didn't belong in a residential neighborhood at this hour. The realization that her location had been compromised came not as a shock, but as a confirmation of possibilities she'd been mentally preparing for since her arrival in Phoenix. Her extraction from Baghdad 3 months earlier had been hasty, enough to leave certain loose ends, and intelligence operations inevitably generated consequences that emerged unpredictably. Rather than panic or attempt immediate escape, Sarah began implementing protocols designed for exactly this scenario. Her morning routine continued outwardly unchanged while she activated systems and made preparations that transformed her suburban home into a coordination center for whatever was about to unfold. The tactical teams had positioned themselves with the precision that comes from extensive training and detailed reconnaissance. They understood that Sarah Mitchell wasn't a target to be captured, but an asset to be protected, and their deployment reflected the difference between these two very different types of operations. Perimeter security established multiple layers of protection while maintaining the appearance of routine neighborhood activity. Communication protocols ensured coordination between team elements without using frequencies that might be monitored by hostile intelligence services. Most importantly, the operation was designed to be invisible to everyone except Sarah herself and the immediate command structure directing the mission. What the neighbors of Sunset Ridge neighborhood witnessed that morning was the visible manifestation of capabilities that usually remained hidden. The men and women who surrounded Sarah Mitchell's house represented years of training, millions of dollars in specialized equipment, and operational expertise developed through missions that would never be publicly acknowledged. Their presence in a Phoenix suburb marked the intersection of covert operations and ordinary American life, where the extraordinary work of protecting national security occasionally became visible to citizens who assumed such things happened only in distant countries or movie theaters. As the sun rose over the Sonoran Desert, casting long shadows across carefully maintained lawns and revealing the tactical positions that had been established in darkness, Sarah Mitchell finished her coffee and prepared to face whatever consequences had finally caught up with her quiet suburban exile. The 8 scars on her body told a story of survival under impossible circumstances, but the presence of Navy SEALs surrounding her house suggested that her most challenging mission might be just beginning. Detective Ryan Parker received the first call at 6:47 a.m., just as he was reviewing case files over his third cup of coffee at the Phoenix Police Department East Precinct. The dispatcher's voice carried an unusual tension as she relayed reports of suspicious activity in the Sunset Ridge neighborhood. Multiple residents were calling about unmarked vehicles, tactical personnel, and what appeared to be a coordinated operation surrounding a residence on Mesa Drive. Parker had handled hundreds of similar calls over his career, typically involving drug raids, federal investigations, or gang-related activities that occasionally spilled into suburban areas. What made this call different was the caliber of the descriptions coming from witnesses. These weren't the usual vague reports from panicked neighbors seeing shadows and imagining threats. Mrs. Helen Abbott, a retired school principal with a reputation for precise observation, provided details that suggested professional military or law enforcement activity. She described personnel wearing advanced tactical gear, moving with coordinated precision, and employing equipment she'd never seen in routine police operations. Her account included specific observations about communication protocols, vehicle positioning, and security measures that demonstrated either extensive knowledge of such operations or the presence of something far beyond typical law enforcement activity. Parker's initial assumption was that federal agencies were conducting a raid without proper notification to local authorities, a jurisdictional oversight that happened periodically but usually got resolved with a few phone calls. His first contact was with the DIA regional office, where his liaison assured him that no operations were scheduled in that area. The FBI field office provided similar responses, as did a TF and other agencies that typically coordinated with local law enforcement for suburban operations. Each conversation deepened his confusion, as agencies that should have known about major tactical deployments claimed no knowledge of activities matching the witness descriptions. Officer Lisa Rodriguez had been dispatched to investigate, and her radio reports added layers of complexity to an already puzzling situation. She confirmed the presence of multiple tactical personnel, but couldn't identify their agency affiliation or obtain clear answers about the nature of their operation. The team leader had been professionally courteous but had declined to provide the standard information typically shared between law enforcement agencies. Most significantly, Rodriguez reported that the tactical teams were not conducting a raid or arrest operation, but appeared to be providing security or protection for the residence and its occupant. The house at 1247 Mesa Drive belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a name that generated no significant hits in local databases. Parker's routine background check revealed the basic information: consistent with a law-abiding citizen, valid driver's license, current registration for a Honda Civic, no criminal history, and employment records indicating work as a government contractor specializing in overseas intelligence analysis. Her credit history showed responsible financial management. Her utility payments were current, and her presence in the neighborhood dated back exactly 3 months, when she'd purchased the property through a cash transaction that raised no red flags given her apparent income level. What Parker found interesting was not what the records contained, but what they didn't. Sarah Mitchell's background appeared comprehensive but somehow sterile, lacking the typical complexity of most people's lives. There were no traffic violations, no insurance claims, no medical records at local hospitals, and no social media presence beyond the most basic professional networking profiles. Her employment history showed consistent work with various government contractors, but the specific nature of her duties was classified at levels that local law enforcement couldn't access. The overall impression was of someone who had constructed a carefully maintained civilian identity that would satisfy casual scrutiny while concealing deeper complexities. Marcus Thompson arrived at Desert View Medical, center for his evening shift, with the strange coincidence still occupying his thoughts. 3 months earlier, he'd observed Sarah Mitchell during her treatment and recovery from severe injuries sustained in Baghdad. Now the same woman was apparently the focus of a military-style operation in suburban Phoenix. His experience as a Navy corpsman had taught him to recognize patterns that civilians might miss, and the coincidence seemed far too significant to be random. Combat injuries followed by tactical operations suggested someone whose work continued to generate consequences long after specific missions concluded. During his break, Marcus made discreet inquiries among the medical staff who had treated Sarah during her emergency visit. Dr. Emily Chun confirmed that the case had been unusual in multiple respects, from the military medical transport that had brought her from Baghdad to the immediate classification of all treatment records. The patient herself had demonstrated familiarity with combat medicine and had maintained professional composure despite significant trauma. Most telling was the complete absence of family, friends, or colleagues making inquiries about her condition during her recovery period. For someone supposedly working as a civilian contractor, she had seemed remarkably isolated from normal support networks. The medical records that Marcus could access through his maintenance clearance painted a picture of someone with extensive combat experience. The 8 stab wounds had been inflicted by someone with knowledge of anatomy, targeting areas that would cause maximum damage while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. The pattern suggested interrogation techniques designed to extract information through escalating trauma, rather than random violence or robbery attempts. Sarah's survival had required not just medical intervention, but also the kind of physical conditioning and mental resilience that came from specialized training in surviving hostile interrogation. Dr. Chen's notes included observations about Sarah's behavior during treatment that supported Marcus's assessment of her background. She had provided detailed information about her injuries and medical history when required for treatment, but had volunteered nothing about the circumstances that had caused them. Her pain responses had been controlled through techniques that suggested training in managing physical trauma, and she had demonstrated awareness of medical procedures that went beyond what civilian contractors typically learned. Most significantly, she had asked specific questions about her recovery timeline that seemed focused on when she would be operational again, rather than when she would be comfortable. Captain James Wilson's security review of Sarah's treatment period revealed additional anomalies that supported the conclusion that this was no ordinary civilian contractor. The military personnel who had accompanied her medical transport had carried credentials that Wilson recognized as belonging to highly classified operations units. Their security protocols had included measures typically reserved for personnel whose compromise would threaten ongoing national security operations. The patient herself had participated in planning her own security arrangements, making suggestions that demonstrated professional expertise in protection operations and threat assessment. The evening news coverage of the Mesa Drive incident was minimal and carefully managed. Local stations reported briefly on unusual police activity in the Sunset Ridge neighborhood, but provided no details about the nature of the operation or the agencies involved. Federal authorities had apparently contacted news organizations with guidance about security considerations that limited reporting to basic acknowledgement that an incident had occurred. The sanitized coverage was typical of situations involving classified operations, where public awareness was managed to prevent interference with ongoing security concerns, while maintaining the appearance of normal news reporting. Sheriff Robert Hayes had spent the afternoon making phone calls to contacts throughout federal law enforcement and military agencies, seeking information that might explain the morning's events. His conversations had yielded increasingly sophisticated non-responses that suggested he was approaching the boundaries of compartmentalized operations where information was restricted to personnel with specific clearances and direct operational involvement. The careful language used by his contacts indicated that Something significant was happening, but that its details were protected at levels that exceeded routine interagency cooperation. What troubled Hayes most was the complete absence of coordination with local authorities. Even the most sensitive federal operations typically included some level of communication with local law enforcement to prevent conflicts and ensure public safety. The Mesa Drive operation had proceeded without any notification to Phoenix police, suggesting either an emergency that hadn't allowed time for proper coordination or activity so highly classified that standard protocols had been suspended. His experience suggested that such departures from normal procedures indicated either immediate threats to national security or the protection of assets, whose compromise would have far-reaching consequences. Mrs. Helen Abbott had positioned herself at her front window throughout the morning, maintaining detailed observations of the tactical operation across the street. Her retired teacher's instincts for cataloging details had provided her with information that she sensed was significant even if she couldn't interpret its full meaning. The personnel surrounding Sarah Mitchell's house had moved with a coordinated precision she remembered from military ceremonies, but their equipment and procedures suggested combat operations rather than ceremonial activities. Most intriguing was their obvious respect for the woman they were apparently protecting, treating her not as a civilian requiring rescue, but as a colleague whose expertise they valued. The tactical teams had maintained their positions throughout the morning with the patience that suggested extensive training and clear mission parameters. Helen observed them rotating responsibilities, maintaining communication protocols, and adjusting their deployment in response to changing conditions in ways that indicated professional military operations rather than law enforcement activities. Their presence had transformed the quiet suburban street into a secure perimeter without alarming residents or disrupting normal neighborhood activities. The skill required for such operations suggested elite units with specialized training in urban protection missions. Dr. Anderson, the trauma surgeon who had treated Sarah's injuries 3 months earlier, had been contacted by federal authorities, requesting copies of all treatment records and notes related to her case. The official request had been accompanied by paperwork that elevated the classification level of her medical information and transferred responsibility for her ongoing care to military medical facilities. Anderson's experience with combat injuries had led him to conclude that Sarah's wounds were consistent with professional interrogation techniques rather than random violence. But he had documented his observations in language that avoided speculation about the circumstances that had caused them. The surgical repair of Sarah's injuries had required techniques typically used for combat trauma, addressing not just the immediate damage but also the long-term implications for someone who might need to return to physically demanding duties. Anderson had recommended extended recovery time and ongoing physical therapy, but Sarah had insisted on accelerated rehabilitation that suggested urgent operational requirements. Her knowledge of her own physical capabilities and recovery potential had impressed him as being far beyond what civilian contractors typically possessed, indicating either extensive medical training or previous experience with similar injuries. Detective Parker's investigation into Sarah Mitchell's background had expanded beyond routine database searches to include interviews with neighbors and local businesses where she might have established patterns of activity. The picture that emerged was of someone who maintained the appearance of normal suburban life while avoiding the kind of personal connections that would provide detailed information about her actual circumstances. She shopped for groceries at different stores on rotating schedules, used cash for most transactions, and had never been observed entertaining visitors or engaging in social activities that would reveal information about her background or current situation. The few neighbors who had interacted with Sarah described her as polite but reserved, someone who participated in community activities enough to avoid standing out, but never enough to develop close relationships. Her knowledge of current events and local issues was comprehensive, suggesting someone who monitored her environment carefully, But her personal opinions and background remained mysteries even to people who had lived near her for 3 months. The overall impression was of someone trained to maintain cover identities through careful management of public interactions and personal information. Officer Rodriguez had filed her report about the Mesa Drive incident with detailed descriptions of the tactical personnel and their equipment, but her attempts to follow up with the agencies that should have been involved had met with responses that suggested the operation fell outside normal law enforcement channels. The equipment she had observed included specialized communication devices, weapons systems, and protective gear that exceeded what local or federal agencies typically deployed for civilian operations. Most significantly, the tactical teams had operated with the kind of independence that suggested direct military command rather than joint law enforcement coordination. The residents at 1247 Mesa Drive showed no external signs of the mornings events by evening, when Parker conducted his own surveillance of the property. The house appeared completely normal, with standard suburban security measures and no indication that it had been the focus of a major tactical operation. Sarah Mitchell's Honda Civic was parked in the driveway. Lights were visible in several rooms, and the overall appearance suggested routine evening activities. Only someone aware of the morning's events would have noticed the subtle improvements to the property's security systems that had been installed during the tactical team's presence. Captain Wilson's evening security briefing at Desert View Medical Center included updates about Sarah Mitchell's case that had arrived through channels he rarely encountered. Federal authorities had requested ongoing monitoring of any medical facilities where she might seek treatment, with instructions to implement maximum security protocols and immediate notification procedures if she appeared at any emergency room or medical office. The nature of these instructions suggested someone whose medical history was connected to ongoing national security concerns rather than routine healthcare needs. The implications of Sarah Mitchell's medical records extended beyond her individual case to broader questions about civilian contractor safety and the medical support provided to personnel working in hostile environments. Her injuries had required the kind of trauma surgery typically associated with military casualties, but her employment status as a civilian contractor meant that her treatment fell into administrative categories that didn't adequately address the reality of her service. The gap between her official civilian status and her actual operational role had created complications in providing appropriate medical care and ongoing support. Marcus Thompson's evening shift included maintenance work in areas of the hospital where classified medical equipment was stored and tested. His security clearance allowed him access to information about specialized medical protocols used for treating personnel involved in sensitive government operations. Sarah Mitchell's case file, while heavily redacted, contained enough information to confirm his assessment that she was far more than a civilian contractor. The medical equipment that had been brought for her treatment, the specialized surgical techniques that had been required, and the ongoing security measures surrounding her case all pointed to someone whose work had placed her in extreme danger. On behalf of national security operations, the evening brought no resolution to the questions that had emerged throughout the day about Sarah Mitchell's identity and the circumstances that had brought tactical teams to her suburban Phoenix home. Detective Parker's investigation had revealed someone whose carefully constructed civilian life concealed complexities that extended far beyond routine government contract work. The medical personnel who had treated her injuries recognized combat trauma that belied her official status as a civilian contractor. The tactical operation that had surrounded her house demonstrated the kind of protection typically reserved for personnel whose compromise would threaten ongoing national security operations. Sheriff Hayes concluded his day with the understanding that the Mesa Drive incident represented something beyond the jurisdiction and clearance levels available to local law enforcement. His contacts in federal agencies had provided enough information to confirm that legitimate government operations were involved but had made clear that details would remain classified indefinitely. The careful balance between acknowledging that something significant had occurred while protecting operational security suggested activities that continued to generate consequences requiring ongoing management and protection. Dr. Emily Chun's evening review of Sarah Mitchell's case files reinforced her conclusion that the patient she had treated 3 months earlier was someone whose work had placed her in circumstances far more dangerous than typical civilian employment. The combat injuries, the military medical transport, the immediate classification of treatment records, and now the tactical operation at her residence, all supported the assessment that Sarah Mitchell's civilian contractor status was a cover for much more significant service to national security operations. The gap between her apparent civilian life and the reality of her actual situation raised questions about the support and protection provided to personnel whose work required such extensive cover identities. As darkness settled over the Sunset Ridge neighborhood, the only visible signs of the day's unusual events were the subtle enhancements to security systems that had been installed at 1247 Mesa Drive during the tactical operation. Sarah Mitchell's house appeared identical to its neighbors, maintaining the suburban anonymity that had protected her cover for 3 months. But the presence of Navy SEALs that morning had marked the end of her quiet exile and the beginning of whatever consequences had finally caught up with her carefully hidden past. The 8 scars from her Baghdad injuries served as permanent reminders of the prices paid for service in the shadows of national security operations. The tactical teams that had surrounded her Phoenix home represented capabilities that most Americans never saw but that operated continuously to protect interests that extended far beyond individual safety or comfort. As Sarah prepared for whatever mission parameters would emerge from the day's events, she understood that her brief respite from operational duties was ending and that her expertise would once again be required in circumstances that demanded everything she had learned from surviving the impossible. The secure communication that arrived at Detective Parker's desk at 4:30 p.m. came through channels he'd never encountered in 22 years of law enforcement. The message originated from a Department of Defense liaison office he didn't know existed, requesting his immediate presence at a briefing scheduled for 1800 hours at coordinates that corresponded to a nondescript office building near Sky Harbor International Airport. The formal language and classification markings suggested that his investigation into Sarah Mitchell had attracted attention from agencies operating far above local law enforcement levels. Parker's drive to the specified location took him through industrial areas where aircraft maintenance facilities and cargo operations created a landscape of functional buildings designed for efficiency rather than appearance. The address led to a complex that could have housed any type of commercial operation, with no external signage or indicators of its actual purpose. Security personnel at the entrance checked his identification against lists that confirmed his appointment but provided no information about the nature of the meeting or the agencies involved. The briefing room contained a dozen individuals whose presence suggested the convergence of multiple government interests on Sarah Mitchell's situation. Federal agents from agencies Parker recognized sat alongside military personnel whose unit affiliations weren't immediately apparent. The atmosphere was professional but tense, indicating that whatever had brought these representatives together carried significant implications for national security operations. Most notably, the civilian clothes and careful absence of identifying marks suggested that this meeting was occurring outside normal interagency channels. Agent David Clark introduced himself as the Department of Homeland Security liaison coordinating federal response to what he termed an evolving situation involving a high-value government asset. His briefing began with acknowledgments that local law enforcement had been conducting legitimate investigations into unusual activities in their jurisdiction, but that circumstances now required federal coordination to protect ongoing national security operations. The careful language indicated that Parker was being briefed, not because his investigation had been welcomed, but because it had become impossible to ignore. The information provided about Sarah Mitchell transformed Parker's understanding of the woman who had been living quietly in the Sunset Ridge neighborhood for 3 months. Her official status as a civilian government contractor concealed work with intelligence agencies that operated in some of the world's most dangerous locations. The injuries she had sustained in Baghdad were the result of capture and interrogation by hostile forces who had discovered her real identity during what should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission. Her survival and escape had required capabilities that went far beyond what civilian contractors typically possessed. Clark's presentation included sanitized details about Sarah's background that explained both her presence in Phoenix and the tactical operation that had surrounded her home. After her medical treatment and initial debriefing, she had been placed in protective custody while intelligence agencies assessed the security implications of her compromise. The quiet suburban lifestyle she had maintained was designed to provide security while analysts determined whether her identity had been shared with other hostile networks that might attempt to eliminate her or extract additional information about her operations. The tactical teams that had appeared at her residence represented the activation of protection protocols triggered by intelligence indicating that hostile operatives had located her Phoenix safe house. The Navy SEALs and other specialized personnel were not conducting an operation against Sarah but implementing emergency security measures to protect an asset whose knowledge of ongoing operations made her a priority target for elimination. Morning's activities had included not just perimeter security, but also preparations for potential extraction if the threat level escalated beyond what could be managed through static protection. Commander Michael Torres provided the military perspective on Sarah's situation, explaining that her work had involved deep cover operations in regions where traditional military personnel couldn't operate effectively. Her civilian contractor status had provided diplomatic cover for intelligence activities that required someone with her specific linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and operational skills. The missions she had undertaken involved gathering information about terrorist networks, weapons trafficking operations, and other threats that required someone capable of blending into local populations while maintaining contact with intelligence agencies. The 8 stab wounds Sarah had received represented a systematic interrogation designed to extract information about American intelligence operations in the Middle East. Her captors had employed techniques calculated to break down psychological resistance while keeping her alive long enough to provide comprehensive information about agent networks, operational procedures, and ongoing missions. Her survival had depended not just on physical endurance, but on counter-interrogation training that had allowed her to provide false information while protecting genuine intelligence that could have compromised dozens of other operatives. Torres explained that Sarah's escape from captivity had involved killing 3 of her captors and fighting her way out of a secure facility, while suffering from blood loss and other injuries that should have been incapacitating. Her ability to navigate hostile territory while wounded, establish contact with friendly forces, and maintain operational security despite her physical condition demonstrated capabilities that placed her among the most elite operatives in American intelligence services. The medical evacuation that had brought her to Phoenix had been necessary, not just for treating her injuries, but for extracting her from a region where her continued presence posed risks to ongoing operations. Dr. Emily Chun received a direct communication from military medical authorities requesting her presence at a classified briefing about her former patient. The meeting took place at Luke Air Force Base, where her civilian credentials were verified and she was escorted to a secure facility, typically used for debriefing military personnel returning from sensitive deployments. The medical officers who briefed her represented specialties in combat trauma and the psychological impacts of interrogation that she rarely encountered in civilian emergency medicine. The military medical perspective on Sarah's case revealed aspects of her treatment that had been concealed during her stay at Desert View Medical Center. The 8 stab wounds had been accompanied by other injuries consistent with extended physical abuse, designed to break down resistance to interrogation. Her psychological evaluation had indicated trauma responses that suggested days or weeks of captivity rather than a single violent incident. Most significantly, her physical condition upon rescue had indicated that she had continued fighting and attempting escape throughout her captivity, sustaining additional injuries in the process. The specialized treatment Sarah had received after her discharge from civilian medical care had addressed not just her physical injuries, but also the operational implications of her compromise. Military psychologists had worked with her to assess what information she might have revealed under duress, while intelligence analysts had evaluated the potential consequences for ongoing operations in the region where she had been captured. The results had indicated that her counterinterrogation training had been largely successful, but that her identity and operational methods were now known to hostile networks that posed ongoing threats to her safety. Dr. Chen learned that Sarah's case represented broader challenges in providing medical support to personnel whose work required deep cover identities. Traditional military medical facilities couldn't treat someone whose civilian contractor status was essential to ongoing operations. But civilian hospitals lacked the security measures and specialized expertise required for personnel returning from hostile interrogations. The hybrid approach that had been used for Sarah's treatment had provided necessary medical care while maintaining the cover identity that protected other aspects of her work. Marcus Thompson's evening conversation with a fellow veteran who worked security at Luke Air Force Base provided additional context about the military personnel who had been deployed to Sarah's neighborhood. His contact confirmed that the tactical teams represented multiple elite units coordinated for a protection mission rather than an assault operation. The equipment and procedures observed by civilian witnesses were consistent with protocols used for protecting high-value assets whose compromise would threaten multiple ongoing operations rather than just individual safety. The military medical records that Marcus could access through his veterans' healthcare system revealed that Sarah's treatment had involved specialists in combat trauma who typically worked with special operations personnel. The surgical procedures, rehabilitation protocols, and ongoing monitoring systems were designed for operatives whose work required them to return to high-risk duties, despite injuries that would typically result in medical retirement for conventional military personnel. Her case had been managed as a priority medical intervention for someone whose expertise and knowledge made her continued operational capability essential to national security. Thompson's analysis of the tactical operation suggested that the personnel deployed to Sarah's neighborhood represented some of the most elite units in American military forces. The coordination, equipment, and procedures required for protecting a compromised intelligence operative in a civilian environment demanded capabilities that were available only to specially trained teams with extensive experience in unconventional warfare. The fact that such resources had been allocated to Sarah's protection indicated that her value to ongoing operations justified extraordinary measures to ensure her safety. Sheriff Robert Hayes received a formal briefing from federal authorities that provided enough information to satisfy his jurisdictional concerns while maintaining security around ongoing operations. The meeting took place at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, where federal representatives explained that legitimate government activities were taking place in his jurisdiction, but that details would remain classified to protect both the operations and the personnel involved. The careful balance between transparency and security suggested that Sarah Mitchell's situation involved considerations that extended far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. The federal briefing confirmed that Sarah was not a criminal, suspect, or security threat, but rather a government employee whose work had placed her in circumstances requiring extraordinary protection measures. The tactical teams that had been deployed to her residence were implementing security protocols designed to protect someone whose knowledge of ongoing operations made her a priority target for hostile intelligence services. The operation had been conducted without prior notification to local authorities because of time constraints and security considerations that required immediate action to address emerging threats. Hayes learned that Sarah's civilian contractor status provided necessary cover for intelligence work that couldn't be conducted through traditional diplomatic or military channels. Her presence in Phoenix represented a temporary security arrangement while federal agencies assessed long-term protection requirements and determined whether she could safely return to operational duties. The coordination between federal agencies and military units suggested that her case involved multiple aspects of national security that required resources from different government departments. The evening brought a shift in the official response to media inquiries about the Mesa Drive incident, with federal authorities providing carefully crafted statements acknowledging that legitimate government operations had taken place while declining to discuss details for security reasons. The sanitized public information was designed to satisfy journalistic interest while protecting the operational details that could compromise ongoing security measures. Local news coverage remained minimal and focused on reassuring the public that no threat to community safety had existed. Captain James Wilson's security review of the hospital's handling of Sarah's case had attracted attention from federal authorities, who were conducting comprehensive assessments of all facilities and personnel that had been involved in her treatment. The review process involved security specialists who evaluated not just the medical care that had been provided, but also the information security measures that had been implemented to protect her identity and medical records. The thoroughness of the federal review suggested that Sarah's case had implications for other ongoing operations that required similar medical support arrangements. Wilson learned that the military medical team that had accompanied Sarah's treatment represented specialized capabilities for providing medical care to intelligence operatives whose injuries couldn't be treated through normal military medical channels. The hybrid civilian-military medical approach had been necessary to provide appropriate care while maintaining the cover identities that protected other aspects of her work. The successful coordination between civilian medical facilities and military medical specialists had established protocols that could be used for similar cases in the future. The specialized equipment that had been brought for Sarah's treatment included medical devices, typically used for treating combat injuries and field conditions, adapted for use in civilian medical facilities. The combination of military medical expertise and civilian hospital resources had provided capabilities that neither system could have offered independently. Wilson's security assessment had confirmed that the medical information security measures had successfully protected Sarah's identity and treatment details from unauthorized access. Mrs. Helen Abbott's detailed observations of the tactical operation had been documented by federal investigators who were conducting comprehensive after-action reviews of the security measures that had been implemented. Her account provided civilian perspective on the effectiveness of security protocols designed to protect high-value assets in suburban environments without alarming local residents or disrupting community activities. The professional conduct of the tactical teams had successfully balanced security requirements with community relations considerations. Abbott's interview with federal investigators revealed that the tactical personnel had been virtually invisible to most neighborhood residents, despite implementing comprehensive security measures around Sarah's residence. The skill required for conducting such operations in civilian environments demonstrated training and expertise that exceeded what most local residents had ever observed in law enforcement or military activities. Her detailed observations had provided valuable feedback about the effectiveness of urban protection protocols. The federal investigators confirmed that Abbott's observations about the professional conduct and advanced equipment of the tactical teams were accurate, and that her discretion in sharing information only with appropriate authorities had been appreciated. Her background as a retired educator had provided her with observational skills and judgment that had been valuable in assessing the community impact of the security operation. The investigators assured her that the activities she had witnessed represented legitimate government operations designed to protect national security interests. Detective Parker's evening briefing with federal authorities had provided him with enough information to understand that his investigation had intersected with classified operations involving personnel whose work required extraordinary protection measures. The briefing had confirmed that Sarah Mitchell was a legitimate government employee whose civilian contractor status concealed intelligence work that had placed her in extreme danger. The tactical operation at her residence had been necessary to protect someone whose knowledge of ongoing operations made her a priority target for hostile intelligence services. The federal coordination that had emerged from Parker's investigation had established protocols for managing similar situations where local law enforcement activities might intersect with classified operations. The balance between legitimate law enforcement concerns and national security requirements had been achieved through briefings that provided sufficient information to address jurisdictional questions while maintaining operational security. Parker's professional handling of the investigation had been noted by federal authorities as an example of effective cooperation between different levels of law enforcement. Parker understood that his role in Sarah Mitchell's case had concluded with the federal briefing, but that his experience with classified operations had marked him as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information in future situations. The protocols that had been established for coordinating between local law enforcement and federal agencies would provide frameworks for managing similar cases where national security operations intersected with civilian law enforcement activities. The evening concluded with Sarah Mitchell remaining in her Phoenix residence under protection arrangements that had been enhanced but made less visible following the morning's tactical operation. The federal response to the security threat that had triggered the morning's activities had successfully neutralized immediate dangers while maintaining the cover arrangements that protected ongoing operations. Her continued presence in the Sunset Ridge neighborhood represented the successful balance between security requirements and operational necessity. The 8 scars from her Baghdad injuries had healed physically, but the operational implications of her capture and interrogation continued to generate security requirements that extended far beyond individual protection. The tactical teams that had surrounded her home represented capabilities that operated continuously in the shadows of American national security, protecting assets and operations that most citizens never knew existed. Her case demonstrated the complex arrangements required to support personnel whose work demanded everything while receiving little public recognition or acknowledgement. As Phoenix settled into evening routines, the Sunset Ridge neighborhood appeared completely normal despite having been the focus of one of the most sophisticated protection operations ever conducted in a suburban American community. The tactical teams had departed as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind security enhancements that were invisible to casual observation, but that provided ongoing protection for someone whose knowledge and expertise remained essential to national security operations. Sarah Mitchell's quiet suburban exile would continue, but under arrangements that reflected both the value of her service and the ongoing threats that her work had generated. The classified briefing room at Luke Air Force Base filled with personnel representing the highest levels of American intelligence and military operations as Admiral Catherine Brooks prepared to reveal the full scope of Sarah Mitchell's service record. The audience included senior officials from the CIA, NSA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and Special Operations Command, all of whom had been cleared for information that would never appear in public records or official histories. The comprehensive Nature of the briefing indicated that Sarah's case had implications extending far beyond individual protection to broader questions about how America supported its most valuable intelligence assets. Admiral Brooks began with Sarah's recruitment 15 years earlier, when linguistic abilities and cultural adaptability had identified her as a candidate for deep cover intelligence work in regions where traditional military or diplomatic personnel couldn't operate effectively. Her training had encompassed not just intelligence gathering techniques, but also survival skills, counter-interrogation methods, and the psychological preparation required for maintaining cover identities under extreme stress. The investment in her development had represented millions of dollars and years of specialized preparation that had created capabilities possessed by fewer than a dozen operatives worldwide. Sarah's operational history included assignments in 7 countries across 3 continents, where she had gathered intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted weapons trafficking networks, and provided early warning about regional conflicts that could have escalated into broader international crises. Her work had required her to assume multiple identities, each maintained for months or years, while she developed the relationships and access necessary to penetrate organizations that pose significant threats to American interests. The consistency of her success across such diverse environments had established her as one of the most effective intelligence operatives in American history. The Baghdad operation that had resulted in her capture represented the culmination of an 18-month infiltration of a network coordinating attacks against American installations throughout the Middle East. Sarah had successfully identified key personnel, funding sources, and operational plans that had enabled military forces to disrupt multiple planned attacks and capture dozens of operatives. Her cover as a cultural researcher studying historical sites had provided access to archaeological locations being used to smuggle weapons and coordinate terrorist activities, making her uniquely positioned to gather intelligence that couldn't be obtained through conventional surveillance methods. Admiral Brooks explained that Sarah's capture had occurred when a security breach in another operation had exposed her identity to the terrorist network she was investigating. Rather than immediately extracting her when the compromise was discovered, intelligence agencies had allowed her to continue operating while attempting to identify the source of the security leak. The decision had been based on assessments that her intelligence gathering was too valuable to interrupt and that her training would enable her to evade capture if necessary. The subsequent events had proven that assessment incorrect, resulting in her torture and the near loss of one of America's most capable intelligence assets. The 8 days of captivity that Sarah had endured represented one of the most comprehensive interrogations ever survived by an American intelligence operative. Her captors had employed physical torture, psychological manipulation, and threats against innocent civilians in attempts to extract information about American intelligence networks, operational procedures, and ongoing missions throughout the region. Counter-interrogation specialists analyzing her debriefings had determined that she had successfully protected virtually all sensitive information while providing enough false details to satisfy her interrogators and prevent escalation of the torture. Sarah's escape had required her to overcome not just physical restraints and armed guards, but also the effects of injuries and blood loss that should have prevented any physical activity. Intelligence analysts had reconstructed her escape route through security camera footage and physical evidence, determining that she had killed 5 armed guards and traversed 3 miles of hostile urban territory while suffering from wounds that had required immediate surgical intervention. Her ability to maintain operational effectiveness under such conditions had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic assessments of her training and preparation. The medical treatment Sarah had received following her rescue had addressed not only her physical injuries, but also the psychological trauma associated with extended torture and the operational stress of maintaining cover identities for years at a time. military psychologist specializing in the treatment of special operations. Personnel had worked with her to process the experiences while maintaining the mental resilience required for potential return to operational duties. The complexity of her psychological treatment had reflected the unique stresses faced by intelligence operatives, whose work required them to assume false identities while operating in constant danger. Commander Torres provided additional details about the tactical challenges involved in Sarah's rescue, which had required coordination between special operations forces, intelligence agencies, and diplomatic personnel operating in a hostile environment. The rescue operation had involved infiltrating an urban area controlled by the terrorist network, locating Sarah in a secure facility, and extracting her while preventing the compromise of other ongoing operations in the region. The successful completion of such a complex mission under extreme time pressure had required capabilities available only to the most elite military units. The intelligence that Sarah had gathered during her 18 months in Iraq had provided the foundation for operations that had disrupted terrorist networks throughout the Middle East and prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of American military personnel and civilians. Her information had enabled the capture of key terrorist leaders, the seizure of weapons caches, and the identification of funding sources that had significantly degraded the operational capabilities of multiple hostile organizations. The strategic value of her intelligence work had justified the extraordinary resources devoted to her rescue and ongoing protection. Dr. Emily Chun's detailed medical assessment of Sarah's injuries had provided crucial information for intelligence agencies evaluating the interrogation techniques that had been used against her, and the information that might have been compromised during her captivity. The pattern and severity of her wounds had indicated systematic torture designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining her physical ability to provide information. Medical analysis had confirmed that her survival had depended not just on physical endurance, but on mental techniques that had enabled her to maintain focus and resistance, despite extreme pain and psychological pressure. The medical challenges involved in treating someone with Sarah's background had extended beyond addressing her physical injuries to managing the security implications of her presence in civilian medical facilities. Her treatment had required coordination between military medical specialists and civilian hospital staff, with security measures that protected both her identity and the medical personnel involved in her care. The successful integration of military and civilian medical capabilities had established protocols that could be used for treating other intelligence operatives who required similar medical support while maintaining operational security. Dr. Chun learned that Sarah's case represented broader challenges in providing comprehensive support to personnel whose work required them to operate under deep cover for extended periods. Traditional military medical and psychological support systems were designed for personnel whose service was acknowledged and whose identities were known to support networks. Intelligence operatives like Sarah operated in isolation from normal support systems, making their medical and psychological care more complex and requiring specialized approaches that balance treatment needs with security requirements. Marcus Thompson's background as a Navy corpsman had provided him with insights into the medical aspects of Sarah's case that civilian medical personnel might have missed. His experience with combat injuries had enabled him to recognize that Sarah's wounds were consistent with systematic torture rather than random violence. Information that had been valuable to intelligence analysts assessing the implications of her capture. His discretion in handling sensitive medical information had been noted by security personnel conducting comprehensive reviews of everyone who had been involved in Sarah's treatment. Thompson's observations about Sarah's behavior during her medical treatment had provided additional confirmation of her professional background and training. Her responses to medical procedures, her knowledge of combat medicine, and her focus on operational rather than personal concerns during recovery had been consistent with special operations personnel rather than civilian contractors. His recognition of these indicators had contributed to security assessments that had helped protect her cover identity while ensuring that she received appropriate medical care. The veteran networks that Thompson was connected to had provided informal channels for sharing information about unusual medical cases that might involve military personnel operating under civilian cover. His contacts with retired special operations personnel had confirmed that Sarah's case represented the kind of hybrid civilian-military medical challenge that required careful coordination between different medical systems. The successful handling of her case had demonstrated the value of having experienced military medical personnel in civilian facilities where such coordination might be necessary. Detective Parker's final briefing with federal authorities had provided him with comprehensive understanding of Sarah Mitchell's background and the circumstances that had brought elite military units to suburban Phoenix. The information had transformed his perception of the case from a routine investigation into unusual activity to an appreciation of the complex arrangements required to support personnel whose work demanded extraordinary sacrifice while receiving minimal public recognition. His professional handling of the investigation had earned him consideration for future assignments involving coordination between local law enforcement and federal agencies. Parker learned that Sarah's presence in Phoenix had been part of a comprehensive security arrangement designed to provide protection while intelligence agencies assessed the long-term implications of her compromise. The quiet suburban environment had offered security advantages, while allowing her to recover from her injuries and undergo debriefing processes that would inform decisions about her future assignments. The tactical operation that had surrounded her home had been triggered by intelligence indicating that hostile operatives had located her safe house and were planning attempts to capture or eliminate her. The coordination between local law enforcement and federal agencies that had emerged from Parker's investigation had established frameworks for managing similar situations where national security operations intersected with civilian law enforcement activities. His experience had demonstrated the importance of maintaining professional standards, while recognizing the legitimate security concerns that sometimes required extraordinary measures. The protocols developed from his case would provide guidance for other law enforcement agencies that might encounter similar situations in the future. Sheriff Hayes had concluded his involvement in Sarah's case with a deeper appreciation for the complex security arrangements that operated continuously throughout American communities without public knowledge or recognition. The federal briefings he had received had provided sufficient information to satisfy his jurisdictional concerns while maintaining the security requirements that protected ongoing operations. His cooperation with federal authorities had been noted as an example of effective coordination between different levels of law enforcement and national security agencies. The operational security measures that had been implemented in Maricopa County during Sarah's case had involved resources from multiple federal agencies and military units, demonstrating the priority that her protection had received within national security planning. Hayes had learned that similar arrangements existed throughout the country, where personnel whose work required extraordinary security measures were protected through coordination between federal agencies and local authorities. The success of these arrangements depended on the discretion and professionalism of local law enforcement personnel who might encounter classified operations. Hayes's experience with Sarah's case had established him as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information about national security operations that intersected with local law enforcement responsibilities. His handling of the jurisdictional challenges had earned recognition from federal authorities and established relationships that would be valuable for managing future situations involving classified operations. The protocols that had been developed for his department would serve as models for other law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona and neighboring states. Captain Wilson's security assessment of Desert View Medical Center's handling of Sarah's case had resulted in comprehensive updates to the facility's protocols for treating patients whose medical care involved national security considerations. The successful coordination between civilian medical personnel and military medical specialists had established the hospital as a resource for similar cases that might require hybrid medical support arrangements. The security measures that had been implemented had protected both Sarah's identity and the medical personnel involved in her care, while maintaining the quality of treatment that her injuries had required. Wilson learned that the medical equipment and procedures that had been used for Sarah's treatment represented capabilities that few civilian medical facilities possessed, making Desert View Medical Center a valuable resource for intelligence agencies and military units that might require specialized medical support. The security clearances and training that had been provided to key medical personnel had created capabilities that could be activated for future cases involving personnel whose medical care required extraordinary security measures. The medical record security systems that had been implemented for Sarah's case had established standards that could be applied to other situations involving classified medical information. Wilson's security expertise had contributed to the development of protocols that balanced medical care requirements with information security needs, creating frameworks that protected sensitive information while ensuring that medical personnel had access to the information necessary for providing appropriate treatment. Mrs. Helen Abbott's role as an observant neighbor had provided valuable feedback to federal authorities about the effectiveness of security operations conducted in suburban environments. Her detailed observations had confirmed that the tactical teams had successfully balanced security requirements with community relations, maintaining comprehensive protection while minimizing disruption to neighborhood activities. Her discretion in handling sensitive information had been appreciated by federal investigators, conducting comprehensive reviews of the operation. Abbott's background as a retired educator had provided her with observational skills and analytical capabilities that had been valuable for assessing the community impact of security operations. Her feedback had contributed to improvements in protocols for conducting protection operations in civilian environments, helping to ensure that future operations would be even more effective at maintaining security while preserving community relations. Her cooperation with federal authorities had been noted as an example of responsible civilian involvement in national security operations. The neighborhood watch networks that Abbott coordinated had been briefed about general security awareness procedures that would help them recognize and report suspicious activities that might threaten community safety. The training had been designed to improve community security without compromising ongoing operations or revealing information that could endanger personnel operating under cover identities. The balance between community involvement and operational security had been achieved through careful selection of information that enhanced safety while protecting sensitive operations. The long-term arrangements for Sarah's continued presence in Phoenix had been finalized through coordination between intelligence agencies, military units, and local authorities. Her status as a protected intelligence asset would continue indefinitely, with security measures that had been made less visible but remained comprehensive. The successful resolution of the immediate threats that had triggered the tactical operation had enabled her to remain in the secure environment that had been established for her recovery and ongoing debriefing processes. Sarah's future assignments would be determined through comprehensive assessments of her physical and psychological recovery, the operational security implications of her previous compromise, and the intelligence requirements that could benefit from her unique capabilities and experience. The possibility of her return to operational duties represented a significant intelligence asset, but would require careful evaluation of the risks and security measures necessary to protect her and the operations she might be involved in. The medical and psychological support that Sarah would continue to receive had been designed to address not only her recovery from the Baghdad injuries, but also the long-term effects of years of deep cover operations. The specialized treatment programs had been developed specifically for intelligence operatives, whose work required them to maintain false identities while operating in extreme danger for extended periods. The success of these programs would determine whether she could safely return to operational duties or would transition to other forms of service that utilized her expertise while minimizing personal risk. Detective Parker had received an informal offer to consider federal law enforcement positions that would utilize his experience with classified operations and his demonstrated ability to coordinate between local and federal agencies. The opportunity represented recognition of his professional capabilities and his trustworthiness in handling sensitive information. His decision about pursuing federal law enforcement career opportunities would be based on his assessment of how he could best serve public safety and national security interests. The protocols that had been developed from Parker's investigation would be implemented throughout Arizona law enforcement agencies, providing frameworks for managing situations where local investigations intersected with classified federal operations. The training programs based on his experience would help other law enforcement personnel recognize and appropriately respond to circumstances involving national security operations. The success of these programs would improve coordination between different levels of law enforcement while maintaining the security requirements that protected ongoing operations. Parker's experience with Sarah's case had provided him with insights into the complex world of intelligence operations and the extraordinary measures sometimes required to protect personnel whose work demanded ultimate sacrifice while receiving minimal public recognition. His appreciation for the dedication and professionalism of intelligence operatives had been deepened through his involvement in protecting someone whose service had prevented terrorist attacks and saved countless lives. Through her courage and expertise, the broader implications of Sarah Mitchell's case extended to fundamental questions about how America supported personnel whose work required them to operate in the shadows of national security operations. Her injuries and the circumstances that had caused them represented the prices paid by individuals whose service could never be publicly acknowledged but whose contributions were essential to protecting American interests worldwide. The comprehensive resources that had been devoted to her protection and recovery demonstrated the value placed on such personnel by the agencies they served. The intelligence networks that Sarah had helped to disrupt through her 18 months of undercover work in Iraq had represented significant threats to American military personnel and civilians throughout the Middle East. Her sacrifice in accepting capture rather than abandoning her mission had enabled the prevention of multiple terrorist attacks and the capture of key terrorist leaders whose organizations had been planning large-scale operations against American interests. The strategic value of her intelligence work had justified the extraordinary resources devoted to her rescue and ongoing protection. The medical and psychological treatment that Sarah had received represented the most advanced capabilities available for treating personnel who had endured extended torture while maintaining operational effectiveness. Her recovery had provided valuable information for improving the training and support provided to other intelligence operatives who might face similar circumstances. The lessons learned from her case would contribute to better preparation and support for personnel whose work required them to accept extraordinary risks on behalf of national security. The tactical operation that had surrounded Sarah's Phoenix home had demonstrated the capabilities available for protecting high-value intelligence assets whose knowledge and experience made them priority targets for hostile intelligence services. The coordination between multiple elite military units and federal agencies had shown the priority that her protection received within national security planning. The success of the operation had confirmed that America possessed the resources and expertise necessary to protect personnel whose service had earned them such comprehensive support. Sarah Mitchell's story represented the reality of intelligence work that operated continuously in the shadows of international relations, where dedicated professionals accepted extraordinary risks to gather information that prevented conflicts and protected American lives. Her injuries from the Baghdad interrogation served as permanent reminders of the prices paid by individuals whose service could never be fully acknowledged but whose contributions were essential to national security. The comprehensive support she had received demonstrated America's commitment to protecting personnel whose sacrifice had earned them the highest levels of recognition and protection available. The 8 scars that marked Sarah's body told a story of survival under impossible circumstances, of resistance to torture that had protected vital intelligence, and of escape that had required capabilities possessed by only the most elite operatives. Her quiet presence in suburban Phoenix represented the successful balance between security requirements and the normal life that her service had earned. The Navy SEALs who had surrounded her home had symbolized America's commitment to protecting those who had risked everything in service to their country. As evening settled over the Sunset Ridge neighborhood, Sarah Mitchell sat on her front porch reading a book, appearing to any observer as simply another suburban resident enjoying the desert sunset. The security measures that protected her remained invisible but comprehensive, ensuring that she could live peacefully while her contributions to national security continued through ongoing debriefings and consultations. Her story would never be told publicly, but her service would be remembered by those who understood the true cost of protecting American interests in a dangerous world. The legacy of her intelligence work would continue through the networks that had been disrupted, the attacks that had been prevented, and the lives that had been saved through her courage and expertise. The personnel who had been trained based on lessons learned from her experiences would carry forward the capabilities that had made her so effective. The medical and security protocols that had been developed for her case would protect other operatives who accepted similar risks in service to their country. 6 months after the tactical operation that had transformed a quiet Phoenix morning into a demonstration of America's most elite protective capabilities, Sarah Mitchell stood in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior intelligence officials who would determine the next phase of her career. The 8 scars from her Baghdad ordeal had faded to thin lines that served as permanent reminders of her sacrifice, but the psychological evaluation reports spread across the conference table indicated that her mental resilience remained as formidable as ever. The question facing the assembled officials wasn't whether she had recovered from her injuries, but whether the intelligence community could afford to risk losing her expertise again to the dangerous missions that had made her so valuable. General Patricia Coleman, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, opened the classified hearing with a comprehensive review of Sarah's contributions to national security over her 15-year career. The operations she had conducted across 7 countries had prevented dozens of terrorist attacks, disrupted weapons trafficking networks worth billions of dollars, and provided intelligence that had shaped American foreign policy in 3 different regions. Her unique combination of linguistic abilities, cultural adaptability, and operational skills had made her virtually irreplaceable in penetrating organizations that posed the most serious threats to American interests worldwide. The intelligence gathered during Sarah's 18-month infiltration of the Baghdad terrorist network had continued to generate operational successes long after her extraction. The detailed information she had provided about funding sources, communication methods, and organizational structures had enabled intelligence agencies to track and disrupt related networks throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Her sacrifice in maintaining her cover despite the risks had yielded strategic advantages that would continue protecting American lives for years to come. Admiral Catherine Brooks presented the medical assessment that would influence decisions about Sarah's future assignments. The physical recovery from her injuries had been complete, with no limitations on her ability to perform the demanding physical requirements of deep cover operations. More significantly, the psychological evaluation had indicated that her mental resilience and operational judgment had not been compromised by her ordeal. The counter-interrogation techniques that had enabled her to protect vital intelligence while enduring systematic torture had actually strengthened her psychological preparation for future high-risk assignments. The debate among the intelligence officials reflected competing priorities between protecting a valuable asset and utilizing her unique capabilities for missions that no one else could perform. Sarah's expertise in Middle Eastern cultures and languages had been developed through years of immersive experience that couldn't be quickly replicated in other operatives. The network she had penetrated and the relationships she had developed provided access to information sources that would be lost if she transitioned to different types of service. However, her compromise in Baghdad had made her a known target for hostile intelligence services that would continue seeking opportunities to capture or eliminate her. Commander Michael Torres argued for Sarah's return to operational duties, emphasizing the critical intelligence requirements that only someone with her background could address. The terrorist networks that had captured and tortured her had been significantly degraded but not eliminated, and their efforts to rebuild their capabilities posed continuing threats that required the kind of deep cover penetration that Sarah had mastered. The investment in her training and the knowledge she had gained through her operational experience represented resources that would be wasted if she were assigned to less demanding duties. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the military psychologist who had overseen Sarah's recovery, provided a different perspective on the risks and benefits of returning her to operational status. While her psychological evaluation had been positive, the long-term effects of extended torture and the stress of maintaining deep cover identities for years at a time created cumulative risks that needed to be carefully considered. The intelligence community had a responsibility to protect personnel who had already sacrificed so much, even when their continued service could provide significant operational advantages. Sarah herself had requested the opportunity to address the panel, understanding that her input would be crucial to decisions about her future. Her presentation was characteristically direct and focused on operational requirements rather than personal preferences. She acknowledged the risks associated with returning to deep cover work, but emphasized her unique qualifications for missions that posed critical national security implications. Her willingness to accept dangerous assignments reflected not recklessness but a clear-eyed assessment of the threats that required her specific expertise to address effectively. The intelligence requirements that had originally led to Sarah's recruitment had intensified rather than diminished during her recovery period. Terrorist organizations had adapted their methods in response to the disruptions caused by her intelligence gathering, requiring new approaches to penetration and surveillance that built on the techniques she had developed. The relationships and access she had cultivated over years of operational work provided advantages that would take other operatives years to develop, if they could develop them at all. Director Coleman outlined the enhanced security measures that would be implemented if Sarah returned to operational duties, including improved communication protocols, expanded support networks, and emergency extraction procedures designed to prevent the kind of capture she had endured in Baghdad. The lessons learned from her ordeal had led to significant improvements in the training and support provided to deep cover operatives, making future operations both more effective and more secure. The discussion of Sarah's case had broader implications for how the intelligence community supported personnel whose work required extraordinary risks and sacrifices. Her successful recovery and potential return to operational duties would provide a model for other operatives who might face similar circumstances. The comprehensive medical and psychological support she had received demonstrated the resources available to personnel whose service earned them the highest levels of care and protection. Agent David Clark from Homeland Security, presented the domestic security considerations that had emerged from Sarah's case, including the protocols that had been developed for protecting intelligence operatives during recovery periods and the coordination procedures that had been established between federal agencies and local law enforcement. The success of the protective operation in Phoenix had created frameworks that could be applied to similar situations throughout the country, improving the security available to personnel whose work made them targets for hostile intelligence services. The tactical teams that had protected Sarah's Phoenix safe house had provided detailed assessments of the threats that intelligence operatives faced when their identities were compromised. The sophisticated surveillance and infiltration techniques employed by hostile intelligence services required equally sophisticated countermeasures that went far beyond traditional security arrangements. The successful protection of Sarah's location had demonstrated capabilities that could be applied to protecting other high-value assets whose knowledge and experience made them priority targets for elimination or capture. Detective Ryan Parker had been invited to provide the local law enforcement perspective on the coordination challenges that arose when classified operations intersected with civilian law enforcement activities. His professional handling of the investigation into unusual activities in the Sunset Ridge neighborhood had earned him recognition from federal authorities and had contributed to improved protocols for managing similar situations. His insights had been valuable in developing training programs that would help other law enforcement personnel recognize and appropriately respond to circumstances involving national security operations. Parker's experience had led to his acceptance of a position with the FBI's National Security Branch, where his expertise in coordinating between local and federal agencies would be applied to improving interagency cooperation on counterintelligence operations. The protocols developed from his involvement in Sarah's case would be implemented throughout federal law enforcement agencies, creating better frameworks for protecting classified operations while maintaining effective relationships with local authorities. Sheriff Robert Hayes had provided recommendations about the community relations aspects of conducting security operations in civilian environments, based on his experience managing the jurisdictional challenges that had emerged from the tactical operation at Sarah's residence. His suggestions had contributed to improved procedures for conducting protection operations that minimized community disruption while maintaining comprehensive security. The success of the Phoenix operation had established standards that would guide similar operations throughout the country. Dr. Emily Chun's medical assessment of the treatment challenges involved in caring for intelligence operatives whose injuries resulted from hostile interrogation had influenced the development of specialized medical protocols for similar cases. Her experience with Sarah's treatment had demonstrated the importance of coordinating between civilian medical facilities and military medical specialists to provide comprehensive care while maintaining operational security. The hybrid medical approach that had been successful in Sarah's case would be available for other operatives who required similar treatment. Marcus Thompson's insights as a military veteran working in civilian medical facilities had highlighted the value of having experienced military medical personnel in positions where they could recognize and appropriately respond to unusual medical cases involving classified operations. His discretion and expertise had contributed to the successful treatment and protection of Sarah's identity during her recovery. The informal networks of military veterans in civilian positions had proven valuable for maintaining security around sensitive medical cases. Captain James Wilson's security assessment of Desert View Medical Center had resulted in the hospital being designated as a resource for treating intelligence operatives and other personnel whose medical care involved national security considerations. The security protocols and medical capabilities that had been developed for Sarah's case had established the facility as a model for other civilian hospitals that might be called upon to provide similar services. The successful integration of security measures with medical care had created frameworks that protected both patients and medical personnel. Mrs. Helen Abbott's role as an observant community member had demonstrated the importance of maintaining positive relationships with civilians who might witness security operations conducted in their neighborhoods. Her cooperation and discretion had contributed to the success of the protective operation while maintaining community trust and security. The protocols developed from her involvement would guide community relations aspects of future operations conducted in civilian environments. The comprehensive review of Sarah's case had yielded improvements in every aspect of how the intelligence community conducted deep cover operations, from initial training and deployment through medical support and protective services. Her experiences had contributed to better preparation for operatives accepting similar assignments and had demonstrated the resources available to support personnel whose service required extraordinary sacrifice. The lessons learned from her ordeal and recovery would protect other operatives who accepted comparable risks in service to national security. The decision about Sarah's future assignments was ultimately made through consensus among the intelligence officials who understood both the operational requirements that could benefit from her expertise and the personal costs she had already paid in service to her country. The determination that she would return to operational duties reflected not just the value of her capabilities, but also her own commitment to continuing the work that had defined her career. The enhanced security measures and improved support systems that would protect her future missions represented the intelligence community's commitment to learning from her experiences and providing better protection for all personnel who accepted similar risks. Sarah's return to active duty would begin with assignments that utilized her expertise, while minimizing the risks associated with deep cover operations in hostile environments. Her knowledge of terrorist networks and operational methods would be applied to training other operatives, developing new penetration techniques, and providing analytical support for ongoing operations. The gradual increase in operational responsibilities would allow careful assessment of her readiness for the kind of high-risk assignments that had made her so valuable to national security operations. The intelligence networks that Sarah would help to rebuild and expand would benefit from the lessons learned during her captivity and the insights gained through her survival and escape. Her understanding of hostile interrogation techniques and organizational security measures would inform the development of better operational security procedures for other deep cover operatives. The strategic advantages that her continued service would provide justified the resources devoted to her protection and the risks associated with her return to operational duties. The medical and psychological support that would continue throughout Sarah's career had been designed to address the cumulative effects of extended service in high-stress environments. The specialized treatment programs that had been developed for intelligence operatives would provide ongoing care that maintained their operational effectiveness while protecting their long-term health and well-being. The success of these programs would determine whether personnel like Sarah could sustain long careers in service that demanded everything while providing minimal public recognition. The broader implications of Sarah's case extended to fundamental questions about how democratic societies supported personnel whose work required them to operate outside normal legal and social frameworks while protecting the values and institutions that defined those societies. Her service had required her to assume false identities, penetrate criminal organizations, and accept risks that went far beyond what most citizens would ever face. The comprehensive support she had received demonstrated society's obligation to protect those who sacrificed so much to protect others. The Phoenix operation that had protected Sarah's safe house had showcased capabilities that operated continuously throughout American communities without public knowledge or acknowledgement. The tactical teams that had surrounded her residence represented years of training and preparation that enabled them to respond instantly to threats against high-value assets. Their success had confirmed that America possessed the resources and expertise necessary to protect personnel whose service had earned them the highest levels of security and support available. Detective Parker's transition to federal law enforcement had been facilitated by his demonstrated ability to handle classified information and coordinate effectively between different agencies and jurisdictions. His experience with Sarah's case had provided him with insights into the complex world of intelligence operations that would be valuable throughout his federal career. The protocols he had helped develop would improve coordination between local and federal agencies on counterintelligence operations throughout the Southwest. The neighborhood watch programs that Mrs. Abbott coordinated had been enhanced with training that would help community members recognize and report suspicious activities, while understanding the importance of discretion when they encountered legitimate security operations. The balance between community involvement and operational security had been achieved through careful education that improved safety while protecting sensitive operations. The success of this approach would guide community relations efforts for security operations conducted in civilian environments throughout the country. The medical protocols that had been developed for Sarah's treatment would be implemented at civilian hospitals throughout the country that might be called upon to treat intelligence operatives or other personnel whose medical care involved national security considerations. Dr. Chung's experience had demonstrated the importance of training civilian medical personnel to recognize and appropriately respond to unusual medical cases, while maintaining the security measures necessary to protect sensitive information. The hybrid civilian-military medical approach would provide better care for personnel whose injuries resulted from service in classified operations. Captain Wilson's security expertise had contributed to the development of comprehensive protocols for protecting sensitive medical information, while ensuring that medical personnel had access to the information necessary for providing appropriate treatment. The balance between medical care requirements and information security needs had been achieved through careful planning that protected both patients and medical providers. The success of these protocols would guide the treatment of other personnel whose medical care involved classified information. The tactical innovations that had emerged from the Phoenix protection operation would be incorporated into training programs for elite military units responsible for protecting high-value assets in civilian environments. The coordination procedures that had been developed between different military units and federal agencies would improve the effectiveness of similar operations while minimizing the resources required and the disruption to civilian communities. The success of the operation had established new standards for protective operations conducted in suburban environments. Sarah Mitchell's story represented the reality of intelligence work that operated continuously in the shadows of international relations, where dedicated professionals accepted extraordinary risks to gather information that prevented conflicts and protected American lives worldwide. Her injuries from the Baghdad interrogation served as permanent reminders of the prices paid by individuals whose service could never be fully acknowledged but whose contributions were essential to national security. The comprehensive support she had received and would continue to receive demonstrated America's commitment to protecting personnel whose sacrifice had earned them recognition at the highest levels of government. The 8 scars that marked her body would always remind her of the 8 days of torture she had endured to protect American intelligence operations and the lives of other operatives working throughout the Middle East. Her survival and escape had required capabilities that few people possessed and courage that even fewer could sustain under such circumstances. Her willingness to return to operational duties reflected not just personal resilience, but professional dedication to protecting others through service that demanded everything while expecting nothing in return. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, she understood that her work would continue to require her to assume false identities, penetrate hostile organizations, and accept risks that most people could never imagine. The enhanced security measures and improved support systems that would protect her future missions represented the intelligence, community's commitment to learning from her experiences and providing better protection for all personnel who accepted similar risks. Her service would continue in the shadows where such work belonged, protecting a country that would never know her name but would benefit from her sacrifice. The legacy of her intelligence work would extend far beyond the specific operations she had conducted or the network she had penetrated. The training programs based on her experiences would prepare other operatives for the challenges they would face in hostile environments. The medical and security protocols developed from her case would protect personnel who found themselves in similar circumstances. The coordination procedures that had emerged from her protection operation would improve the effectiveness of security measures designed to protect America's most valuable intelligence assets. The Sunset Ridge neighborhood had returned to its quiet suburban routine, with no visible signs that it had once been the focus of one of the most sophisticated protection operations ever conducted in an American community. Sarah's house remained under discreet security, arrangements that protected her while maintaining the appearance of normal residential life. The success of these arrangements had demonstrated that high-value intelligence assets could be protected effectively while maintaining the cover identities that enabled their continued service. The Navy SEALs who had surrounded her home that morning had represented capabilities that most Americans never saw, but that operated continuously to protect interests that extended far beyond individual safety or comfort. Their presence had marked not the end of Sarah's service, but a transition to new phases of work that would continue to require everything she had learned from surviving the impossible. The tactical excellence they had demonstrated in protecting her had confirmed that America's most elite forces possessed the capabilities necessary to protect personnel whose service had earned them such comprehensive support. Sarah Mitchell's name would never appear in public records or official histories, but her contributions to national security would be remembered by those who understood the true cost of protecting American interests in a dangerous world. Her willingness to accept extraordinary risks in service to her country represented the dedication and professionalism of intelligence operatives whose work could never be publicly acknowledged, but whose sacrifices were essential to preserving the freedoms and security that defined American society. The morning sun rising over the Arizona desert illuminated a community where ordinary citizens lived peacefully, protected by extraordinary individuals whose service remained invisible, but whose dedication was absolute. Sarah Mitchell's story was one of thousands of similar stories that would never be told publicly, but that represented the reality of how democratic societies protected themselves through the service of individuals willing to sacrifice everything for causes greater than themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.